Bavaria, April 1945. The morning air hung cold and still over Kirchdorf, broken only by the distant rumble of engines that didn't sound like anything the villagers had heard before. In the basement of the half-collapsed municipal building, 12-year-old Greta Weber sat clutching a worn primer, her knuckles white against the pages. Her teacher's voice trembled as she delivered the final lesson. When the Americans arrive, they will show no mercy. Greta had been taught that American soldiers were savages, criminals who would separate families and punish German children for their father's war. Every lesson, every warning, every whispered rumor had prepared her for cruelty. The next morning, hiding in the damp church cellar with her younger brother Klaus pressed against her side, she heard the boots above. Heavy, foreign. The cellar door opened, flooding them with light, but instead of shouting, instead of rifles pointed downward, came something Greta had never imagined. A young soldier, barely older than a boy himself, descended halfway down the stairs, reached into his pack, and placed a Hershey's chocolate bar on the step. Then he backed away, palms open, and said in broken German, "For you! Safe!" Her teacher hissed that it was poison, a trick, exactly what they'd been warned about. But Greta's stomach betrayed her, growling at the smell of food. When the soldier placed a warm hamburger beside the chocolate and simply walked away, not demanding, not threatening, just leaving, something inside her cracked open. She climbed the stairs, picked up the chocolate, and as the sweetness touched her tongue, tears filled her eyes. Not from relief, from the terrible realization that everything she'd been taught, everything she'd believed, might have been a lie. And if they'd lied about this, what else had been a lie? Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more documented accounts that reveal the complicated truth behind history's most powerful moments, and drop a comment with your city and time. We're amazed by where these stories reach. Bavaria, April 1945. Kirchdorf had once been a postcard village, the kind travelers would photograph on their way to Munich, with neat rows of half-timbered houses and a church steeple that could be seen from the valley road. Now it was rubble and silence. The Americans were coming. Everyone knew it. The question was when and what they would do when they arrived. In the basement of the only building still standing well enough to call functional, 8 children sat on broken chairs that had been salvaged from houses that no longer existed. The smallest was 6. The oldest was 14. They listened to Fräulein Hartmann with the kind of attention that comes not from discipline, but from fear. Greta Weber sat in the second row, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was 12 years old, thin in the way children become when meals have been scarce for years, her dark hair pulled back in 2 careful braids her mother had plaited that morning. On the desk sat her primer, a thin book with a red cover that had seen better days. Inside were lessons about geography, about mathematics, and tucked between the pages, propaganda sheets warning about the enemy. She had read them so many times she could recite passages from memory. Americans were savages, criminals, a nation without culture or honor, driven only by greed and violence. They would burn what remained of German homes. They would separate families. They would punish children for their father's war. Fräulein Hartmann stood at the front of the makeshift classroom, her back straight despite the tremor in her hands. She was 54 years old and had been teaching in Kirchdorf since before Greta was born. Her voice had always been firm, the kind of voice that commanded respect without needing to rise in volume. But today it cracked at the edges. She told them the Americans would arrive in 2 days, maybe 3. She told them there was a plan. When the soldiers came, the children would hide in the old church cellar. It was deep, cool even in summer, and the entrance could be concealed if they were careful. There were supplies already stored there, dried beans and turnips, not much but enough to wait out the first wave of occupation. Hartmann's hands shook as she wrote the meeting time on the chalkboard fragment propped against the wall. Her fingernails were dirty. Greta noticed that. She had never seen her teacher with dirty fingernails before. It was then that Greta understood something she had never quite allowed herself to think before. Hartmann was terrified, not just worried or cautious, but genuinely, deeply afraid. The adults did not have answers. The adults did not know what would happen next. The realization sat in Greta's stomach like a stone. Around her, the other children shifted in their seats. Little Klaus Weber, Greta's brother, sat beside her, his legs too short to reach the floor. He was 8 years old and still had the round cheeks of early childhood, though they were less round than they had been a year ago. He kept glancing at Greta, trying to read her face for clues about how afraid he should be. She kept her expression calm for his sake. That was what their father would have wanted. Their father, who had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 winters ago, a postal worker conscripted into a war he had never wanted to fight. Greta remembered him as a quiet man who smelled of ink and paper, who read to them before bed, who believed in order and fairness and doing one's duty. She had believed everything he believed because he was her father, and fathers told the truth. When Hartman dismissed them that afternoon, the children filed out into the gray light with unusual silence. No one ran. No one shouted. They walked home through streets that had once been familiar and now felt like the ruins of someone else's village. Greta held Klaus by the hand, her grip firm, guiding him around broken glass and piles of brick that had once been the bakery, the butcher shop, the place where her mother bought thread. That evening, Greta helped her mother prepare their hiding supplies. Anna Weber moved through the small room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and workroom all at once with mechanical efficiency. She was 38 but looked older, her face drawn, her hands rough from years of seamstress work that had become the family's only income after Greta's father died. She did not speak much as she wrapped the last of their bread in cloth, as she filled a canteen with water from the pump, as she counted and recounted the small pile of belongings they would carry. Greta watched her mother's face and saw the same thing she had seen in Hartman's hands that morning. Fear, barely contained. The adults were pretending at competence, at control, but underneath they were just as lost as the children. That was when they heard it. Engines. Distant at first, a low rumble that could have been thunder if thunder came from the north instead of the sky. But it grew closer, a sound that did not belong to any German vehicle Greta had ever heard. Heavier, slower, foreign. Anna Weber's hands stopped moving. The bread fell from her fingers onto the table. She turned to look at Greta, and in that moment her face collapsed, all pretense gone. The plan had been 2 days away. They were here now. Anna grabbed Klaus, pulled him close, her voice sharp with panic. They had to run. Now. The church was 6 streets away. Greta snatched up the small bag her mother had prepared, slung it over her shoulder, and followed as her mother dragged Klaus through the door and into the darkening street. Other families were running too, shadows moving through shadows, no one calling out, everyone thinking the same thought. Hide, survive, wait for it to be over. The church loomed ahead, its steeple damaged but still standing, a dark shape against a darker sky. They stumbled through the side entrance, down the narrow stone stairs that led to the cellar. It smelled of damp earth and old stone, a smell Greta associated with winter storage and forgotten things. Hartman was already there with 3 other children. More arrived in 1s and 2s, breathing hard, eyes wide. Someone pulled the cellar door shut. The darkness was immediate and total. Klaus pressed against Greta's side, his small body shaking. She put her arm around him and felt his heart beating fast, like a bird's. In the darkness, his voice came small and fragile. "Will they hurt us, Greta?" She opened her mouth to answer, to say something comforting, something certain, but the words would not come. Because she did not know, none of them knew. They could only wait in the dark and hope that the stories they had been told were wrong. But hope felt dangerous, like another kind of lie. So Greta said nothing. She held her brother close and listened to the sound of engines growing louder above them, coming closer, bringing whatever came next. The night in the church cellar passed without sleep. The children huddled together on the cold stone floor, trying to share warmth, trying not to think about what morning would bring. Greta kept Klaus tucked against her side, one arm around his thin shoulders, feeling him flinch every time they heard movement above. The Americans had come through during the night. They could hear boots on cobblestones, voices speaking that strange, harsh language, the rumble of vehicles moving through the village square. Once, someone had tried the church door. The children had frozen, barely breathing, until the footsteps moved away. Hartman sat with her back against the far wall, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. No one spoke. Speaking felt dangerous, as if sound itself could draw the enemy down into their hiding place. Dawn came slowly, thin gray light seeping through cracks in the cellar door. With the light came new sounds, more boots, more voices, closer this time. Klaus whimpered softly, and Greta pressed her hand over his mouth gently, not to silence him but to remind him of the need for quiet. Her own heart hammered so hard she thought surely the soldiers above could hear it. She had been taught what would happen. The Americans would find them eventually. They would drag the children out into the light. They would separate them from Hartman. They would take them somewhere, do something. The details had always been vague in the warnings, but the threat had been clear. Americans did not show mercy. Americans punished. Americans destroyed. Her father had believed that. Hartman had taught it. Every adult Greta trusted had told her the same thing. But now, sitting in the dark with her brother shaking against her, Greta found herself hoping desperately that every adult she trusted had been wrong. The cellar door opened without warning. Light flooded in, painful after the long night, and Greta threw up her hand to shield her eyes. She could see only silhouettes at first, 3 figures backlit and enormous, blocking the entrance. Soldiers. American soldiers. Giants in her child's perspective, made larger by fear and exhaustion. The children pressed back against the walls, some of the younger ones starting to cry. Hartman pulled them closer, her arms spread as if she could shield all 8 of them with her body. One of the soldiers stepped down onto the first stone step. He was young, Greta realized as her eyes adjusted, not much older than her cousin who had died at Stalingrad. 22, maybe 23. His uniform was dusty, his face unshaven, but his eyes held no rage. He looked tired more than anything else. He said something in English, the words incomprehensible. Then he tried again, his German broken but understandable. Kinder, children, it is okay. Safe. His voice was not harsh. It was quiet, almost gentle, the way you would speak to a frightened animal. No one moved. Greta felt Klaus bury his face against her shoulder. Hartman's grip on the children tightened, her voice sharp when she spoke. Stay back. Do not touch them. The soldier raised both hands, palms forward, showing them empty. He said something else in English to the men behind him, then looked back down at the children. He did not come closer. Instead, he reached into the pack on his back and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. A candy bar. Chocolate. Greta recognized it from before the war, from a time when such things existed in shops. The soldier broke it in half carefully, then placed both pieces on the top step. He backed away, his hands still visible, still open. For you, he said in English, then tried the German words. For you. Then he did something Greta did not expect. He stepped back further, moved toward the church entrance, giving them space. Not forcing, not demanding, just offering and retreating. The chocolate sat on the step, dark and impossible. Klaus's breathing changed. Greta knew that sound. He was staring at the food, his child's hunger overriding his child's fear. None of them had seen chocolate in 2 years. The rations had been bread and turnips, sometimes thin soup, never anything sweet, never anything that was not strictly necessary for survival. Hartman hissed a warning. It is a trick. Do not touch it. They poison food. Everyone knows this. But even as she spoke, another soldier appeared at the entrance. This one looked even younger, barely 19, with a round face that would have seemed at home in any German village. He pulled something from his pack, something wrapped in paper that smelled of meat and bread. A hamburger left over from their morning meal, still faintly warm. He placed it beside the chocolate, then backed away just as the first soldier had done. The smell hit the cellar like a physical thing. Rich. Real. Greta's stomach clenched with sudden desperate hunger that made her dizzy. The 2 soldiers spoke to each other in English, brief, quiet words, then turned and walked away. Their boots echoed on the stone floor of the church, growing fainter until the children were alone again with the food sitting on the step above them. No one moved. Minutes passed. Greta stared at the chocolate and the hamburger and felt something crack inside her, some certainty she had been holding on to. Poisoned food made no sense. If the Americans wanted to hurt them, they could simply hurt them. They had rifles. They had numbers. They had won the war. They did not need tricks. Unless everything she had been taught was wrong. The thought was terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with soldiers or hunger. If the adults had lied about this, what else had they lied about? Klaus stirred against her. She could feel his whole body trembling with want. He was 8 years old and he was starving, and there was chocolate 3 meters away. Greta made a decision. She did not think about it. Thinking would have stopped her. She stood up, her legs stiff from the cold floor, and climbed the stone steps. Her hand shook as she reached for the chocolate. It felt real, solid. She broke off a small piece and put it in her mouth. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, so intense after years of bland food that it almost hurt. It was real chocolate. Not poisoned, not a trick, just chocolate. Her eyes filled with tears, and she did not know why, only that something inside her was breaking apart and she could not stop it. Klaus appeared beside her, then the others one by one, climbing up from the cellar into the gray morning light. They shared the chocolate in solemn silence, breaking it into 8 careful pieces. They shared the hamburger the same way, passing it around, each child taking one bite and handing it to the next. It was cold by then, but it tasted like something from a dream, meat and bread and the faint taste of mustard. When Hartman finally emerged, the last to climb those stairs, she found her students crying. Not from fear, from something more complicated, from confusion and guilt and the terrible realization that monsters do not give hungry children chocolate. Monsters do not walk away and leave food behind. Monsters do not speak gently and show their empty hands. Hartman looked at their tear-stained faces and understood what she had done. She had taught them to fear the wrong things, or perhaps to fear the right things in the wrong way. She sat down on the church step beside them, and for the first time in 12 years of teaching, she had no lesson prepared, no words of guidance, no certainty to offer. She had been wrong. They had all been wrong, and now they would have to learn how to be right. 3 days passed before Greta fully understood what occupation meant. It did not mean fire and chains. It meant soldiers setting up canvas tents in the village square, medical stations in buildings that still had roofs, supply trucks rolling in with crates marked in English. The Americans moved through Kirchdorf with methodical efficiency, posting notices, taking names, organizing the chaos of defeat into something that resembled order. They brought food. Real food, not the scraps and substitutes that had sustained the village for the last 2 years. Condensed milk in small tins, bread made from white flour, potatoes and carrots, and once, impossibly, fresh eggs. They distributed rations from the back of their trucks, calling out names from lists, handing packages to thin hands that reached up with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Greta watched from her mother's doorstep, the chocolate wrapper still folded in her pocket. She touched it sometimes when no one was looking, a piece of evidence that what had happened in the church cellar had been real and not some fever dream born of hunger and fear. Anna Weber accepted the rations with cold correctness. She took what was offered, signed her name where they told her to sign, and walked home without meeting anyone's eyes. At night, she and Greta ate the American food in silence, the taste of white bread sitting strange on tongues accustomed to sawdust and grain husks. Klaus ate with uncomplicated joy, his child's ability to accept goodness without questioning its source still intact. But Anna's face remained hard, her jaw set in a line that Greta recognized as her mother's war face, the expression she wore when doing necessary things she did not want to do. On the 3rd day, Klaus developed an infection in a cut on his hand, a small wound that had seemed insignificant until red lines started spreading up his arm. Anna cleaned it with boiled water and the last of their salt, But by evening, Klaus was feverish, his small body burning against Greta's side as she held him. Anna sat staring at her son with the particular helplessness of a parent watching a child suffer from something she could not fix. There was no doctor in Kirchdorf anymore. Dr. Messer had been killed in an air raid 6 months ago. The nearest help was 12 kilometers away, and they had no vehicle, no horse, no way to get there before the infection spread further. Greta made the decision without asking permission. She walked to the village square where the American medical tent stood, a white canvas structure with a red cross painted on the side. The young soldier from the church cellar stood near the entrance, his rifle slung over his shoulder, talking with another man. When he saw Greta approaching, he straightened, and something in his face changed, became more alert. She stopped 3 meters away, suddenly uncertain. Her English was limited to a few words learned before the war. She held up her hands, pantomiming the gesture he had made in the cellar, showing them empty. Then she pointed back toward her house and tried the only words she could think of. "Brother, sick, help." The soldier looked at her for a long moment, then called over his shoulder into the tent. Another man emerged, older, with a bag in his hand marked with the same red cross. A medic. The soldier from the cellar said something to him in English, gestured toward Greta, and the medic nodded. He looked at Greta and said one word in careful German. "Zeigen." "Show me." She led them back through the narrow streets, past houses where faces appeared in windows and quickly disappeared again. Being seen with Americans felt dangerous, like a betrayal that neighbors would remember and judge. But Klaus's fever was worse than shame, so Greta walked with her back straight and her eyes forward until they reached the small room where her family lived. Anna stood when they entered, her body going rigid, placing herself between the Americans and Klaus. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We do not need your help." The medic did not understand the words, but understood the tone. He stopped just inside the doorway, held up his hands the same way the soldier had done in the cellar, and spoke in slow German. "Your son is sick. I am a doctor. I can help." Anna's face twisted with something that looked like pain. "You are not a doctor. You are an enemy." The medic looked tired suddenly, the kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much weight for too long. He set his bag on the floor, opened it slowly so they could see inside, and pulled out a small glass bottle. Penicillin. Greta recognized the word from before the war. Medicine that could stop infections, medicine that had not been available in Germany for years. The medic held it up so Anna could see, then pointed to Klaus. "He needs this. Today. Tomorrow will be too late." The words were simple, factual, without judgment or threat, just a plain statement of medical truth delivered in the flat accent of someone speaking a language not quite his own. Anna looked at the medicine, then at her son, then back at the Americans. Greta watched her mother's face and saw the moment something broke inside her, some wall of principle giving way before the simple animal need to keep a child alive. Anna nodded once, sharp and angry, and stepped aside. The medic moved quickly then, examining Klaus's hand with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound with supplies from his bag, administering the injection with a practiced hand that spoke of doing this hundreds of times before. Klaus whimpered but did not cry. The soldier from the cellar knelt beside him, pulled something from his pocket and held it out. A small toy soldier carved from wood, American uniform painted in careful detail. Klaus took it with his good hand, staring at the gift with confused wonder. The medic spoke to Anna in his careful German, explaining the dosage, when to return for the next injection, warning signs to watch for. Anna listened with her arms crossed, her face giving nothing away. When the Americans left, she did not thank them. She simply closed the door and stood with her back against it, her hands shaking. Greta found her voice. "Mama, they helped Klaus. They gave him medicine." Anna's eyes were bright with tears she would not let fall. "I know what they did. Do not think I do not know." Her voice cracked. "But your father. They killed your father, Greta. Some American bullet, some American bomb, some American order. And now I must let them save my son." She slid down to sit on the floor, her careful composure finally breaking. How am I supposed to hate them and need them at the same time? Greta sat down beside her mother, the chocolate wrapper still in her pocket, Klaus's fever already beginning to break. She had no answer. She was 12 years old, and the entire moral framework of her world had collapsed into contradictions she could not reconcile. The Americans had killed her father. The Americans had saved her brother. Both things were true. Both things existed in the same moment, in the same heart. That night, Greta lay awake, listening to Klaus breathe easier, his fever dropping as the medicine did its work. She thought about the medic's tired face, about the soldier's empty hands, about the wooden toy that Klaus now clutched even in sleep. She thought about her father, who had believed Americans were savages, who had died fighting a war he never wanted. She thought about what he would say if he could see them now, living on American rations, accepting American medicine, learning that enemies could be decent. Would he understand? Would he forgive her for not hating them? Or would he see it as betrayal, a failure of loyalty to his memory? She did not know, but she knew that Klaus was alive, breathing steadily in the darkness, and that had to count for something, even if she did not yet know what. 2 weeks into the occupation, Kirchdorf had split into 2 camps that did not speak to each other except in necessary transactions and cold glances across the village square. The Müller family had begun working for the Americans, helping organize supply distribution, translating when needed, accepting payment in rations and small luxuries like coffee and cigarettes. Heinrich Müller defended his choice loudly to anyone who would listen. The war was over. Germany had lost. Working with the occupiers was practical, sensible, the only way forward. His wife served American soldiers coffee in their home, and their teenage son ran errands between the command post and various houses, carrying messages in both languages. On the other side stood families like the Schneiders, who refused everything beyond the minimum rations required for survival. Otto Schneider had lost 2 sons in the war, one at Normandy and one in the final desperate defense of Berlin. He would not shake American hands. He would not smile at their jokes. He would not pretend that defeat was anything other than defeat, or that the men who killed his boys were anything other than killers, no matter how much chocolate they distributed. When American soldiers passed his house, he turned his back in silence that spoke louder than any curse. Greta found herself caught between these 2 worlds, unable to choose either one. She accepted the rations because Klaus needed to eat, and her mother's seamstress work barely kept them fed even with American supplies. But she could not bring herself to work for them, to translate or assist or collaborate in any visible way. The chocolate wrapper stayed in her pocket, growing soft and torn from constant touching, a talisman of confusion rather than certainty. At night, she lay awake thinking about her father, trying to remember his face with precision, afraid that accepting American kindness meant letting his memory blur and fade. Then one afternoon, everything changed. The soldier from the cellar, the one who had given Klaus the wooden toy, appeared at their door with another man in uniform. This second man was older, perhaps 30, with kind eyes and an accent that was different from the other Americans. Softer, somehow almost familiar. He introduced himself in perfect German as Corporal Friedrich Lehmann from Milwaukee, a city Greta had never heard of. He explained that he was a translator, that his parents had come from Bavaria before the war, that he still spoke the language his grandmother had taught him as a child. The young soldier, whose name was Sergeant Callahan, had a request. The Americans needed help communicating with the younger children during medical checkups and supply distributions. Many of the smallest ones were too frightened to speak, even when adults translated, but Callahan had noticed that Greta had a way with the other children, that they trusted her, listened to her. Would she be willing to help, just for an hour or 2 each week? The payment would be extra rations, and Klaus could come with her if that made her more comfortable. Anna refused before Greta could speak. "My daughter will not collaborate with you. We accept your food because we have no choice. But we will not work for the people who killed my husband." Her voice was cold, final, the voice she used when a decision was made and argument was useless. Lehman translated her words for Callahan, who listened with the expression that showed neither anger nor surprise, just a kind of weary understanding. He said something in English and Lehman translated it back. The sergeant says he understands. He says his father died too in the First War and his mother never forgave anyone for it, not even the people trying to help her after. He says he respects your choice. Then Callahan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, handing it to Anna. It showed a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10, with braided hair and a gap-toothed smile, standing in front of a white house with a porch. Callahan spoke again, and Lehman's voice softened as he translated. That is his sister, Sarah. She is 12, same age as your daughter. When the sergeant gave Greta that chocolate in the church, he was thinking of Sarah, what he would want someone to do for her if she was hungry and afraid. He is not asking your daughter to betray anyone. He is asking her to help children who remind him of his sister. Anna stared at the photograph for a long moment, and Greta watched something shift in her mother's face, some wall beginning to crack without quite breaking. Anna handed the photograph back without speaking, but her next words came out softer, less certain. What kind of help? Over the next hour, Lehman explained in careful detail. The younger children, those under 8, were having trouble understanding the medical examinations. They needed to be checked for malnutrition, for parasites, for diseases that could spread through the population if left untreated. But they were terrified of the American medics, would not let themselves be touched, cried and fought and made the work impossible. Adult translators made it worse somehow. Their nervousness transmitted to already frightened children. But if someone like Greta, someone they knew and trusted, could explain what was happening, could hold their hands during examinations, could make them understand that no one would hurt them, then the work could be done properly and quickly with less fear all around. It was not politics. It was not collaboration. It was just helping frightened children understand that doctors were doctors, no matter what language they spoke. Greta found her voice before she quite realized she was going to speak. What about Papa? The question was not directed at Lehman or Callahan, but at her mother. Would Papa want me to let children be afraid when I could help them? Anna's face twisted with an expression Greta had never seen before, something between anger and grief and a terrible, exhausted confusion. Your father believed in honor and duty and defending the homeland. He believed what we were all taught to believe. He died for those beliefs. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I do not know if he was right or wrong anymore. I do not know what he would want. I only know he is dead, and I am so tired of being angry. That night, Greta lay awake with Klaus sleeping beside her, turning the question over and over in her mind. In the morning, she would have to choose. Help the Americans with the children, or refuse and maintain the pure hatred that felt like loyalty to her father's memory. But was it loyal to let children suffer because adults had fought a war? Was it honorable to withhold comfort from the frightened because offering comfort meant working alongside the enemy? Her father had taught her to do her duty, to help those who needed helping, to stand for what was right even when it was difficult. But what was right when right and wrong had become so tangled that she could not tell them apart anymore? She thought about Callahan's photograph, about his sister Sarah, who was 12 years old and safe in a place called Iowa, about how he had looked at Greta and seen his sister hungry and afraid. She thought about the little Schultz girl who had cried through her entire medical examination because she thought the American medic was going to hurt her, and how Greta could have explained, could have helped, if only she had been there. She thought about Klaus's fever breaking because an American medic had come when called, had given medicine without asking for gratitude or allegiance or anything except the chance to do his job. Before dawn, Greta made her decision. She would help translate for the children, not because she forgave anyone, not because she had chosen a side, but because children should not have to be frightened of doctors, and she could make them less frightened, and that was something she could do even when she could not understand anything else. When she told her mother at breakfast, Anna did not respond for a long time. Finally, she said, "Your father would not have approved." Then softer, "But your father is not here. And I think maybe he would have been wrong about this. I do not know anymore what he would have been right or wrong about. I only know that Klaus is alive because I let them help, and I cannot build walls against people who save my children. It was not permission exactly. It was not approval. It was just acknowledgement that the old certainties had broken and they were all trying to build something new from the pieces, and no one knew yet what shape that something would take. 6 weeks after the Americans arrived, summer had begun to settle over Kirchdorf, with a gentleness that felt almost like mockery. The weather did not care about defeat or occupation or the complicated work of rebuilding. The sun rose warm and steady, turning the rubble golden in the early light, coaxing wildflowers up through the broken stones. Gardens were being planted in patches of earth cleared between ruined houses. Families who had hidden seed potatoes through the winter now pressed them into soil with the cautious hope of people who had learned not to count on harvest before they came. The Americans had set up a system, organized and methodical in the way Greta was learning was typical of them. Local Germans who had been vetted, their party affiliations examined and judged acceptably minimal, were being trained to take over administrative duties. The occupation would not last forever. That was clear now. The Americans would leave eventually, returning to their own homes across an ocean Greta could barely imagine, and Kirchdorf would have to govern itself again, feed itself again, become something new from the ashes of what it had been. Greta had fallen into a routine that no longer felt strange. 3 mornings a week, she went to the medical tent where Corporal Lehman would greet her in his soft Milwaukee German and explain which children needed help that day. She had become the bridge between fear and treatment, the familiar face that made examinations bearable. She would kneel beside frightened 6-year-olds and explain in simple words what the medic needed to do, would hold small hands while doctors listened to heartbeats and looked into throats and applied ointment to rashes. The children trusted her. That trust felt like both a gift and a burden, something precious and heavy that she had to carry with care. Sergeant Callahan had taken to calling her Fräulein Greta with a small, tired smile that she had learned meant respect rather than mockery. He was 22 years old, she had learned through Lehman's translations, from a place called Iowa where his family grew corn and raised hogs. He wrote letters home every evening, sitting on a crate outside the command tent, his handwriting careful and slow. Once he had shown her a letter from his sister Sarah, the girl from the photograph, full of news about school and friends and a cat that had adopted their family. The ordinariness of it had made Greta's throat tight with an emotion she could not name. One afternoon in early June, Callahan asked through Lehman if Greta would walk with him to the edge of the village. He wanted to show her something. Klaus came along, as he always did now, never far from Greta's side, the wooden toy soldier still in his pocket, worn smooth from constant handling. They walked through streets that were beginning to look less like a battlefield and more like a place where people lived. The Schneiders still turned away when they passed, and Greta felt their judgment like a weight on her shoulders. But the Millers waved, and old Frau Dietrich, who had lost her husband and both sons in the war, nodded with something that might have been approval. The village was learning to live with its divisions, to exist in the uncomfortable space between hatred and acceptance. They reached the road where the American convoy had first entered Kirchdorf that terrible night 2 months ago. Callahan stopped there, looking back toward the village, and spoke in English, while Lehman translated with the careful precision that had become familiar. When we came here, we expected to find Nazis, people who hated us, people who wanted us dead. He paused, choosing words with visible care. But we found you. Children, families, people just trying to survive, same as anyone. He pulled something from his pocket, another photograph, and handed it to Greta. This one showed soldiers, young men in American uniforms, standing in front of a tank. Callahan pointed to faces. That is Danny. That is Martinez. That is Cooper. His voice changed, became flatter. They did not make it to Kirchdorf. They died in France and Belgium, fighting their way here. He looked at Greta, his young face suddenly ancient with the weight of what he had seen. I thought about them when I gave you that chocolate in the church. I thought about what we were fighting for, what they died for. Lehman's voice was gentle as he translated the next words. My little sister is your age, Sarah, back in Cedar Rapids. When I gave you that chocolate, I was not thinking about Germany or America or the war. I was thinking about her. What I would want someone to do if she was hungry and scared and hiding in a cellar. Greta felt something unlock in her chest, some knot of guilt and confusion beginning to loosen. She had been carrying the question for weeks. Was it betrayal to accept kindness from the enemy? Was it dishonor to help them, to work alongside them, to stop hating them with the purity her father's death seemed to demand? But Callahan was not asking her to betray anyone. He was just a young man far from home who saw hungry children and could not walk away. Just as her father had been a postal worker who went to war because he was told it was his duty, who died because young men die in wars whether they want to fight them or not. She found words she had been practicing in English, simple words but true. Thank you for chocolate, for medicine, for Klaus. Her pronunciation was clumsy, but Callahan understood. He nodded, and something in his expression eased, as if he had been carrying his own burden of guilt and her thanks had lightened it slightly. They walked back to the village in comfortable silence, Klaus running ahead, chasing a butterfly through the ruins with the resilience of childhood that could find joy even in broken places. That evening, Greta found her mother in the small garden patch they had cleared behind their house. Anna was on her knees in the dirt, planting seeds with steady hands, her face peaceful in a way Greta had not seen since before the war. Greta knelt beside her, taking up the work without needing to be asked. They worked together as the sun set, pressing seeds into earth, covering them, patting the soil down gently. After a long silence, Anna spoke. "I have been unfair to you. You have been braver than I have. You have done what needed doing while I held on to anger because anger was easier than confusion." She did not look at Greta, kept her eyes on the work, but her voice was steady. "Your father, he was not a bad man, but what he fought for, what we believed." She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. She did not need to. Greta understood. Her father had believed in honor and homeland and duty. He had believed what good people believed when good people were told lies by those they trusted. He had died for those beliefs, and his death did not make the beliefs true, but it did not make him wrong for believing them either. People were more complicated than propaganda. Wars were more complicated than the stories told about them. And moving forward meant learning to hold two truths at once: that her father had been good and the cause he died for had been terrible, that the Americans had killed people she loved and also saved people she loved. That mercy was not weakness and accepting help was not betrayal. And sometimes the bravest thing was to stop hating even when hatred felt like loyalty. They worked until the last light faded, until all the seeds were planted and covered and blessed with the hope of growing. When they finished, Anna sat back on her heels and looked at the small plot of turned earth. "I miss him," she said simply. "So do I," Greta replied. "But missing him does not mean I have to keep believing the lies." Anna reached over and took her daughter's hand, held it in her own dirt-stained fingers. "No," she said softly. "It does not." They sat together in the gathering dark, two women learning to grieve without hate, to remember without poison, to build something new from the broken pieces of what had been.